Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to all. Today is Yom Sheni b'Shabbat, second day of the week, Monday. You will note that we, the Jewish people, have never had and still do not have any name for the days of the week other than the numerical designation, first day, second day, third day. And that is because all other nations connected the days of the week and the planets and stars and all manner of things that human beings see on a daily basis to all forms of all manner of superstitions and avodah zarah, idol worship, and what have you. But we, the Jewish people, have never done so, and as a precaution against any such possibility, we have always referred to the days of the week, and we still refer to the days of the week by the numerical designation, first day, second day, third day. So today, as I just pointed out, is Yom Sheni, the second day. And we also usually refer to it as the Yom Sheni b'Shabbat, the second day of the week. And the week is referred to as Shabbat because the high point of the week is the Shabbat, the Sabbath. So that's just a brief window into the inner mind of the Jewish people. And the date is the 22nd day of the month of Shabbat, Kaf Bet Shabbat, Taushin Pewal, according to our calendar, corresponding to the 9th of February 2026, according to the Gregorian calendar. And with me, once again, are my interlocutors, Rabbi Michael Friedman, a therapist, mental health expert, and Dr. Meir Rosenholz, likewise a therapist and mental health expert, which may lead some people to the conclusion that this is why I'm speaking with these people, because I have a problem of some kind which they're about to resolve, and maybe, who knows? I'm unaware of that, however. Let us hope that is not the case. We are here to discuss other things. So we were discussing, as we did also in a recent conversation, we referred to the pasuk, to the verse. Let me call it up for you, that we looked at in a recent conversation as well. This is chapter 19, verse 6, Perek Yoteth, pasuk well of Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, and you should be able to see it on the screen. And the verse is right here: "V'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'roy kadosh," and you shall be unique for me as a kingdom or nation, a state, actually. Mamlecha, as I pointed out, is a kingdom or a state, a kingdom of priests, v'roy kadosh, and a holy nation. This is what Moshe Rabbeinu is told, Moses is told by Hashem to inform the Jewish people before we receive the Torah, before we receive the Ten Commandments. And we were just now discussing the fact that later shortly after this in the Torah, we find the pasuk. This is in Perek Kaf Hey, chapter 25, and it says here in pasuk Het, verse 8. I will share it with you now again. V'arsu mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, and they shall build for me, especially unique and directed only to me, a temple, v'shachanti b'tocham, and I will dwell amongst them, the Jewish people. So these two pasukim that we're mentioning here, the first one we mentioned about being a mamlacha, a kingdom, a nation, a state, that is to say, an organized, sovereign political entity. And this pasuk here, v'arsu mikdash, and they shall build for me a mikdash, a temple, a holy place, from the shoresh, the root, kadosh, kof dadachin, which is the root in Hebrew for holy. These two pasukim in the galuth, in the exile, were usually somehow one could say, without exaggeration, distorted and and transformed in some way. In other words, with regards to the Mikdash, the temple, there were no end of drashot of Shetlach claiming that the intention is that every Jew is to be a little temple to Hashem, and then I will dwell amongst them in the individual, spiritual individual sense, which is a very fine drasha, but it is only a drasha. It is not the simple pshat of the pasuk. That is not what the pasuk is getting at. The pasuk is referring to the commandment that the Jewish people are commanded to build a temple, a mikdash, exactly what it says. So in the Galuth, this cannot be performed. You cannot build a mikdash in anywhere on earth outside of Yerushalayim, and therefore it becomes inoperative. So what do you do with this pasuk? You do something with it that can be in some way relevant to the individual Jew who's living in Pinsk, Minsk, or Dvinsk, or Morocco, or Teman, or wherever it may be, and you give them a drasha which somehow makes it in some way, at least, meaningful and relevant to them. Again, which is fine. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, it's a very good thing to do, as long as you know that this is only a teaching which has value, and a teaching which essentially came into being in order to make up for the fact that we cannot live up to the simple, plain meaning of the pasuk, and we cannot perform this mitzvah, this commandment. And exactly the same thing is true of the other pasuk that we refer to, namely over here, "Vatem tili mamlechet kohanim v'roi kadosh," which you should be able to see now. Over here, when it refers to a mamlechet kohanim, a nation, a state, that is to say, an official, defined national entity, what we refer to nowadays as a state, something which was always referred to as a kingdom, because all states were kingdoms. This was also somehow transformed in some way to refer to a holy nation on the individual level, that every Jew is to be lead a lifestyle which connects to that which is holy and sublime and above the mundane and the common concerns of human beings, of material human beings on this earth, and that we are to aspire to something above and beyond that. And that's, again, all very true, correct. And that is a lesson that can be applied in all times, including in time of galuth, in time of exile. But the true, simple meaning, of course, is to be a mamlechet kohanim, to be a kingdom, that is to say, a Jewish nation in every sense of that word. And that is what the Jewish nation is all about. That is our job description. That was the point that we discussed last time, and that I'm expanding upon now, connecting it to the concept of mikdash, of temple. Whenever the Jewish people find themselves in a situation not able to connect with the essential meaning of the Torah, naturally and quite understandably, we try to connect to it in a different way, which is also of value, but it's not the real McCoy. It's not the real deal. It's only a temporary stopgap drasha and insight which has its value and meaning, but if we forget that this is not the essential meaning of what the Torah is driving at, then we then we are in great danger of losing sight of what we are all about in actual fact. And that is exactly what I think happened to uh, most of the Jewish people during our very lengthy galuth, exile. And there are still many, many Jews, Torah Jews, who are still, and non-Torah Jews as well, who are still laboring under that misapprehension.
I think that's absolutely correct. And there are so many ways of one's inner experience that we project onto the world, that we believe so strongly in certain ideas because the truth is too difficult and overwhelming in our minds. The hardship is so great that we'll convince ourselves of something that is a deception, or just convince ourselves of something that was true and relevant in an outdated mode of time, an epoch of a previous era, and hold on to it with all of our might because it's too psychologically jarring to deal with in our present state. And it's easier to close our eyes to reality.
I think that is the beauty. This is one of the advantages of speaking to two mental health experts, because you have just encapsulated something which I came to realize many years ago. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. The first thing to understand that is generally not discussed is that galuth, exile, is a traumatic experience. It's a traumatic experience not only in the obvious sense, the physical sense, the real world and political sense. In other words, that the Jews found themselves at the mercy of whatever nation or system or regime within whose power they found themselves. And we are all aware, unfortunately, of the tremendous sufferings that the Jewish people had to endure over the millennia for that reason. And we are not completely at the end of that either, not yet, although our situation is vastly better today than it was for most of the past 2,000 years. But it's also the galuth, the exile, is also a psychological trauma for the Jewish people, and this trauma expresses itself and manifests in all areas of Jewish life, not just in um, certain behaviors or expressions or assumptions, even in our, and maybe even most specifically in our understanding of the Torah or misunderstanding of the Torah. And what you said before, Michael, is I think you reminded me of something which I want to mention here. We have in the Torah, as we know, the mitzvah of sukkah, to reside, to dwell in a sukkah, which is a booth or a shack, or call it what you like, which by the way, have said for many years, and I continue to say and to insist that the etymology of the English word shack is sukkah.
Wow.
Look up the word shack in any
Wow.
English dictionary. I have done this in the Oxford Dictionary, and which I believe is the best of English dictionaries, and they will always provide you with the etymology. Whether the etymologies are correct or not so correct or speculative is another discussion, but they provide you usually with an etymology for the word. What is the language from which this word first uh, sprung? With regards to the word shack, the etymology is origin unknown. At least that's what I recall seeing. There, you can check me on this, and if I'm being imprecise, you'll let me know. But this is what I recall. I haven't looked it up today or yesterday, a long time ago, but I recall that it said origin unknown. And it occurred to me years and years ago that well, the word sukkah is exactly that. It's a shack. It's a temporary dwelling or structure in which a human being might live for a time, temporarily. And I think that's the origin of the word. It's the same shoresh, the same root. So the word sukkah, which is a kind of shack or booth or what have you, a temporary structure in which we are commanded to dwell for 7 days in the month of Tishrei, which is at the beginning of the autumn. Um, Now the mitzvah is to dwell, which means to be there, to eat and drink in this sukkah, and to sleep in this sukkah, etc. Now in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, it doesn't rain all year round. The rainy season begins usually just after Sukkot, but it can rain occasionally during Sukkot as well. But that doesn't happen most of the time. And it's possible to dwell and to sleep in the sukkah, and it's also not so cold. But if you live for example, in Russia, or in Lithuania, or in Poland, or many other places, but there would be a question, first of all, of the cold, of the temperature. It's too cold to really be in a sukkah for any length of time. Certainly not to sleep. In many parts of the world, it's also a fact that it tends to rain fairly regularly every few days. So you're going to get rained out of your sukkah, not infrequently. But let's talk now about temperature, first of all, and snowfalls and the like. So Russia or Lithuania or Poland or Hungary or whatever, Europe in general is not conducive to the mitzvah of sukkah. It just isn't. Neither are many other countries that are more temperate, but rainy, shall we say. But let's talk about that part of the world. So in those parts of the world, certainly Jews, over a very long period of time, became used to the idea that you don't sleep in a sukkah for obvious reasons. And the halacha is the Torah tells us, or the Chachamim tell us, that when it rains, you're not required to be in the sukkah. Or if it's terribly cold, you're not required to be in the sukkah. You're mista'er. It's not something you're supposed to do and suffer. The mitzvah is not to suffer in the sukkah. The mitzvah is to dwell in the sukkah. And if it's impossible to do so in a reasonable manner, then you're not required to do so. So you can, even if it's cold, you can possibly some of the time take a meal out into the sukkah from your kitchen and eat it quickly, even though it's very cold, and run back inside. And many people who have lived in various places outside the land of Israel will be familiar with this practice. And I recall such things, not so much from the cold, but to do with rain. I recall running into the sukkah, eating quickly, and running back into the house because it was drizzling or was about to rain or it just had rained, what have you. And in countries where it's very cold, well, that's just not feasible. So eating maybe was doable. Sleeping was not a practical proposition. Now, what did most Jews do with this reality? How did they deal with this psychologically? Well, the answer is straightforward enough. You understand that it's called in the Torah ones. In other words, this is something beyond your control. You're not, and therefore, and it's not something you can control. It's not something you're responsible for. And you are exempt. You are patur from this mitzvah when it's not possible. So if it's terribly cold, if it's raining, etc., you're not required to be in the sukkah. Okay. All of the Jewish people understood this for a very, very long time. Something like, let's say, 1800 years. And then came along one of the rabbis of Lubavitch, of Chabad. I think it was the Tzemach Tzedek, but I'm not entirely certain. I don't recall. I think it was the one referred to as the Tzemach Tzedek. And this is how I understand the reality. He was unable to deal with this traumatic experience. There was this concept, this reality, that we, the Jews in this part of the world, which is White Russia, that's where Lubavitch is, It's a small town, unheard of until that time, essentially, in White Russia. We are unable to perform this mitzvah properly. That's the fact. And he was not able to deal with this, to internalize this fact and accept it. So he came up. I'm suggesting this was conscious. I'm suggesting it was subconscious. He came up with a very convoluted, completely newfangled explanation and reason why it is not only not necessary to sleep in the sukkah, which is explicitly written in the Mishnah. It's in the most authoritative and fundamental stratum of the Torah Shebaal Peh. It's explicitly stated that one is required to sleep in the sukkah, even just to take a nap. One is required to do this in the sukkah, if at all possible. In other words, if it's not raining and it's not terribly cold, or maybe also terribly hot, or your sukkah is infested with the mosquitoes and you can't possibly sleep there right now. Well, all such reasons are valid reasons why you do not have to sleep in the sukkah. But if that's not the case, then you do have to. But if you live in a place like White Russia, generation after generation, no one has slept in a sukkah. So this halakha becomes inoperative. It doesn't exist any longer. Just like building a mikdash is not operative, doesn't exist. It's not on the books. It's a very ancient collective memory, a relic, but it's not a reality. So he came up with a convoluted, Kabbalistic explanation why it is not only not necessary, but not proper and not correct to sleep in a sukkah. In other words, which completely turns the Torah on its head. And this is exactly what Hagon Harav Eliezer Menachem bin Shach, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, stated in his famous speech in Yad Eliyahu, something like I think nearly 40 years ago, maybe it was 40 years ago now, where he put his foot down and would not allow the Haredi world, and he was in control to a large extent at that point in time of the Haredi world. His influence was paramount at that time. He would not go along with the machinations of certain individuals, such as Aryeh Deri, for example, who wished to create a political union or political arrangement with the Israeli left, the anti-Torah left. The Haredim would join forces with them and thus remove the Likud, so-called right-wing Likud, from power. And Rav Shach was not right-wing; he was left-wing. In other words, he was, in terms of what to do with Eretz Yisrael, he was not right-wing, but he was very much the anti-Torah people. So he and he would not allow this to happen. And because of him, it didn't happen at that time. And during that speech, this is a famous speech that was broadcast live on most Israeli media at that time, an amazing thing in itself. It was a whole stadium. The Yad Eliyahu Stadium in Tel Aviv had been rented out, and it was full of Haredim, and Rav Shach spoke to them. And he also and he spoke freely. He spoke his mind as he tended to do. He didn't pull his punches, and he also spoke his mind about Lubavitch, about Chabad. And he said, and I quote, this is on record, he said that the Rebbe Lubavitch is an apikoros. That's what he said. He is a kofir. He does not accept the Torah. He contradicts the Torah. In which way? He said because he says you're not required to sleep in a sukkah. And the Gemara, that's what he said. The Gemara says you do have to. It's actually a Mishnah, as I'm stating. It's actually a Mishnah, but he said the Gemara says you do have to, and that's correct. And that's how it appears in every halachic handbook, in the Shulchan Aruch, for example. And therefore, his position is completely unacceptable. It contradicts and overturns the Torah, which is a fact. That's a reality. Again, Chabad will tell you that no, we have these deep Kabbalistic explanations which you don't understand, but we do, and we know that it's not the right thing to do, and this is therefore why we do it. But I'm
So
telling you that
Lubavitch, you're saying Lubavitch Bashita does not sleep in the sukkah?
yes, are you not
That's
aware of this fact?
I,
Okay,
that
well
that
that's the
makes
fact.
twice
No,
this
that's
way.
the fact.
Okay,
That's the
fine.
absolute
So they,
fact. In
they
other
have a
words,
shita, so it's not just about
absolutely
cold or
no,
rain.
nothing
They
to do
just
with
do
the weather.
not.
In other words, yes, if you live in Russia, you don't sleep in the sukkah, and I agree, you don't because you can't. Generally, at least that depends where you are, I suppose. But in most places that are referred to as Russia, that time of the year, you can't sleep in the sukkah, and they don't, and that is all Jews behave in this fashion, and that's fine. But as you say, Lubavitch, Chabad have a shita. In other words, they, in principle, will not sleep in the sukkah. They say it's the
Even
wrong
if it's a
thing to
beautiful
do.
night, there's nothing
And
stopping them.
as
It doesn't
in other
matter.
words, if you live in
Mm-hmm.
Kfar Chabad, which
Mm-hmm.
is in Eretz Israel, and the
Mm-hmm.
climate is very mild. It's actually very warm, and it's
Mm-hmm.
perfectly possible to
Mm-hmm.
sleep in the sukkah. They will not
Right.
sleep in the sukkah
Right. I don't know if I
because
knew
it's the
that
wrong
actually.
thing
I
to
don't
do.
know. It's the
It's
wrong
the
thing. I don't
wrong
know if I
thing
knew
to
that.
do. Okay,
Uh-huh.
that's the fact.
Mm.
And they will tell you, and this is true, that the Tzemach Tzedek, if I'm not, I hope I'm not misspeaking, I believe it was the Tzemach Tzedek who came up with this idea that that's the name used to refer to one of their leaders, one of their rabbis. He came up with this, and I said newfangled. I said that very deliberately. In other words, in all Kabbalistic texts up to that time, there was never such a suggestion. It's not in the Zohar, it's not in Kitvei Ha'ari. No one had ever heard of such a thing, including in all those parts of the Jewish world that were completely overrun by and influenced by Kabbalah, etc. No one ever heard of such an idea. But Chabad came up with this idea. And they will tell you that it's based on this Kabbalistic reasoning, etc., etc. And I'm telling you, it has nothing to do with that. That's not the real reason. That's just the excuse. That's the terms in which it is framed. The real reason is Galuth-induced trauma. In the case of the Tzemach Tzedek, he particularly couldn't stomach the fact that we, the Jewish people, are unable to perform this mitzvah of Sukkah properly, fully. We haven't been doing it for a long time, and he could not accept. He couldn't get his head around the idea that it's because of the weather. That we're in Galuth, we're not where the Torah is supposed to be kept and lived by in Eretz Yisrael. We're somewhere else. We've been here for a long time, and therefore this mitzvah of Sukkah has been completely corrupted and upended by by dint of reality. And he couldn't accept it. That was the reason. So he had to come up with a different reason. And of course, the best possible reason is something to which you can attach the word Kabbalah, and then it becomes not only kosher, not only reasonable,
It's
but actually
spotted.
you're on a higher level. If you're not sleeping
Right.
in the sukkah for this reason, then you're on a higher level than anyone who does, because they just don't
Now,
understand the tifkai, the omek, the depth of your understanding of the Torah, and you do, Baruch Hashem, and you being a Chabadnik, you know better than everybody else, obviously, because that by definition is what Chabad think, and if they don't tell you this to your face, that's because they're being polite, but that's the fact, and they and look at the Jewish world in these terms. You have Chabadnikim, then you have Hasidim, then you have Misnagdim, Litaim, and then you have Dati Lumi, and beyond below that is too lowly to even discuss. So they understand that they're the only people who really understand the Torah. That's what a true Chabadnik thinks, without the slightest doubt or question. And that is the reason. Their Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, was driven crazy by the Galuth, by the fact that we cannot sleep in a sukkah, and we have to come up with a better reason than the fact that it's very cold. That's the bottom line. So this also speaks volumes if you are able to extrapolate from what I've just said, and if you accept what I just said as being true, then you understand from this many things that you can find in those parts of the Jewish world that were heavily influenced by Kabbalah. Many things were understood in a new way, redefined, relabeled, and repackaged.
Made up? Is that
You can use you can use that word absolutely. I think yes, but certainly many things were reassessed, redefined, repackaged in a manner which is more significant and meaningful to a Jew living in the reality of Galuth, rather than living in the reality of Eretz Yisrael in a Tanakh informed reality, if you want to put it that way. And this brings me to another story, and then I'll stop for a moment and let you respond. All right. About I would say 36 odd years ago or something like that, I was in Miluim. I was in reserve duty in the army and whatever, and we were sort of, an off time, I had to be with this unit where they were, and I was a chovesh, kravi. I was a combat medic, so if something happened to someone, I was supposed to help them out. But otherwise, I didn't have to do anything specific. So I was learning. What was I doing? I was learning Tanakh. I was reading from a Tanakh, and this uh, non-religious Chiloni soldier, also a miluimnik, a reserve soldier, he was in his 30s, I imagine, said to me, what are you learning? I said, what are you doing? Reading that? I said, I'm reading Tanakh, learning Tanakh. And he said, why learning Tanakh as opposed to something else? Interesting question. So I answered him. I said, yeah, I think it's very important, and it's part of the of what every Jew must study. And I said, but I suspect that you're asking me for not just out of curiosity. I suspect that you're asking me because you've seen other kinds of Jews, perhaps when they've been studying off to the side or something, studying something other than Tanakh, perhaps Gemara, something. I'm not suggesting I don't learn Gemara, but I'm just saying that Tanakh is also something that needs to be studied. And I said, you should understand that many Jews, Torah Jews, are unable to relate to the Tanakh in a very meaningful way because the Tanakh describes a reality, a time, a framework, a psychological reality also, not just a geographical reality, that is so far removed from what most Jews have experienced that is something very foreign to them and very far from what they're able to appreciate and internalize. And therefore, there has been a gradual distancing of the Jewish people from the Tanakh over the during the period of the Galut. That's what I said to this person, and I stand by that. That's what I think. That is the real reason why, if you recall in our last conversation, Mayor, I said that in most yeshivot, and not just Haredi yeshivot, by the way, but particularly Haredi yeshivot, Tanakh is essentially ignored. It's not part of the curriculum, and it's just not on the menu. And this is the fundamental reason, because it is so far from the worldview, the conceptions of a Galuth mode Jew, that it's difficult to relate to. In other words, Jews are not the people who live in Eretz Yisrael. That's not the Jew that he knows.
Mm.
And Jews are not people who fight their enemies. And Jews do not have armies or kings or governments or what have you. Um, so this book, the Tanakh, is full of things which are very foreign and strange to him. That's just the reality. Unless, of course, you begin to understand the Torah, or that is to say, Judaism in a more correct and more wholesome and comprehensive manner, and then you will begin to view things very differently.
Rav Bar-Hayim, I heard you say once, tell me if this is accurate, that of all the codes of Jewish law, the Rambam, Maimonides, was the one who was most holistic in the sense of being incorporative of the entire corpus of what it means to be a nation, a Jewish nation, including all of those systems of government that existed in the time of Tanakh and codified in perpetuity to be a framework for the future and our current reality.
There is no doubt about the veracity of what you just said. Something I have also said many times that the Rambam and a few other Chachamim that need to be mentioned in this context, such as Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the author of the Kuzari, and there are others that we could mention. One could and should mention the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, also in this context. But these Chachamim represent the exception rather than the rule. In other words, the Rambam, you see this as a fact, is the only Chacham, the only great Torah sage, essentially in history, certainly at that time, 850 years ago, who wrote a work which encompasses all areas of the Torah. Ilchot Berachot and Ilchot Shabbat on the one hand, and Ilchot Bet HaBechira and Ilchot Melachim Milhamot on the other hand. You don't find this in the Tur or the Shulchan Aruch or the Rif or the Rosh. You just don't. Why? Because they, by definition, they told you we're writing about those areas of the Torah which are relevant Bazman Hazeh at this time. That was the term that they used, Bazman Hazeh. In other words, at this point in history, that is to say, during the Galut. And therefore you don't need to discuss anything to do with the Jewish army or with the Mikdash or many other things. And it comes up in every area of the Torah, every area of halacha. In other words, if you look up in the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, you look up Hilchot Tefillah, things to do with how one recites the Shmoneh Esrei, the Tefillah, the essential Tefillah, the central Tefillah of Jewish prayers. And it refers to when you bow down, etc. And the different and the Chazal refer to the difference between a regular person and a Kohen Gadol and a Melech. But the Melech, once he bows down at the beginning of the Shmoneh Esrei, doesn't get up again till the end of the Shmoneh Esrei. But you won't find this in the Shulchan Aruch because there's no Melech. So what's there to discuss? But in the Rambam in Chot Tefillah, it's right there. In other words, you cannot escape it. You cannot escape the totality of the Torah when learning the Torah through the lens of the Rambam. You cannot not see it.
Was there ever?
But you can learn many other texts which are very wonderful and in sometimes disagree with the Rambam, and sometimes they may be more correct than the Rambam on this or that detail. But their overall outlook does not include all areas of the Torah in one broad survey.
I'm confused about Rav Yosef Karo. I'm confused because on the one hand, I'm told that he was writing the Shulchan Aruch, his code of Jewish law, was really shorthand and was not meant to replace his extensive commentary, let's say the Beit Yosef. On the one hand, on the other hand, I heard that he was really trying to create somewhat of a constitution that would be adopted in Tzfat and beyond as part of a nascent commonwealth that was meant to emerge from the land of Israel.
I'm not sure I followed you right now. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm confused about the intention of Rav Yosef Karo when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch from Tzfat here in Israel, because I heard on the one hand the Shulchan Aruch was not meant to be really an authoritative code of law. It was meant to be sort of a shorthand for people who didn't have time to learn and learn the sources correctly on how or
That's
thoroughly.
true. That's true.
Okay, and then I also heard that he had an agenda, and his agenda was to create a document, a writ, like a constitution, that was meant to be followed here in Israel as part of an eventual Jewish autonomous area, or what would hope to be a commonwealth in the later time.
Okay, no, I have never heard that latter thing that you just mentioned. I've never heard that. I don't know where that comes from. Um, as any great halachic author, one imagines, as Rambam writes at the end of his Haktamat to Mishneh Torah, he writes, I have gone through all the primary sources, and I have distilled all of that information for you here in this book called Mishneh Torah, which I've written. So I'm making things easy for you if you wish to rely on me. If you don't rely on me, or you know better than me, that's fine. Or you know someone you think there's a better book, that's also fine. This is what I was able to do, and here it is, and do it with it as you will. That's what Rambam says. I'm simply telling you that it's difficult to cover all that material from the primary sources. I know because I've done it, and it's not easy, and it's not something most people will be able to do. And I've given it my all in order to present all of this material for you in a succinct, uh, summarized fashion. Now, exactly the same thing was thought by Rabbeinu Yaakov Ba'ala Turim or by Rabbeinu Yosef Ba'ala Beth Yosef. They all thought that I am going through all these sources and making life easier for other Jews to go through this material. The Beth Yosef is a lengthy commentary on the Torah. The Torah itself is a fairly brief work. Most people never read the Torah just as the Torah. They only read it with everything else on the page. But that's not how Rabbeinu Yaakov Bar Turim envisaged reading the Torah. He thought that I'm writing the Torah, and you can learn just the Torah. Now, it's true, learning the Bet Yosef adds a lot, but it also distracts you, and it doesn't allow you to focus or to cover so much ground. So we always have to think, first of all, what did this Chacham have in mind when he wrote this Sefer, when he wrote this book? The Torah thought that you were going to be the Torah. Not everything else before and after the Torah, just the Torah, because that's, again, it's a shorthand book in which he is different style, different um, framework that he uses from the Rambam, obviously, but it is definitely something which will be much more possible for your average Jew, or even your average learned Jew, to cover than to go through all the primary sources, go through all the Mishnah and all the Tosefta and all the Baraitoth and all the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, etc. That's obviously a huge undertaking. To go through the Torah is much more doable for most people. And the Bet Yosef wanted to expand upon the Torah and comment and sometimes differ with the Torah. Usually the Torah is posek like his father, the Rosh, which is wonderful, which is fine. And the Bet Yosef, a lot of the time, adopted a different approach. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. Based more on the Rambam and the Rif than on the Rosh, usually. But again, these are rules of thumb, not always correct in point of fact when you look at a specific halacha. And to bring all sorts of other opinions, which the Torah did not perhaps quote in the Bet Yosef, and therefore it's a lengthy work, and he quotes huge amounts of material. The Shulchan Aruch is a distilled form, a very brief form of all of that, and he writes explicitly that my aim is that a person should be able to cover the entire Shulchan Aruch in 30 days, every month, without any perush, without any additions, without the Ramah. Just, this is my Shulchan Aruch. It's a summary. It's brief. It's so you can go over it quickly and refresh your memory and find things quickly. And you should be able to cover a lot of ground and do it in a short space of time. Once a month, you should be able to cover this whole Shulchan Aruch. That's what he writes. But once you have very lengthy perushim on it, then that changes the equation altogether, obviously. At any rate, every chacham who writes a sefer is writing what he believes to be true, doing the best he can, trying to help out all other Jews to the best of his ability. And it's up to us to decide whose opinion either we believe or trust, or to try and get to the bottom of each point, each matter, with our own, to the best of our own ability.
So, so the Jewish people are not bound by a specific Rav, Chacham, who wants to make things easier for us. We're not bound to we're not bound to what their opinions are, what their views are. I mean, is that what you're saying? That they're trying to make it easier, but that doesn't mean that we're obligated to.
We are bound to follow the Torah.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
When I say Torah, I mean the Torah shebichtav and the Torah shebe'al peh, and that means Hazar, and that means the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Baraitot and the Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi and other sources, as the Rambam lists and details in his Haktamat to Mishneh Torah. But seeing that there are different views and interpretations with regards to certain parts of all that huge body of material. In other words, on any given sugya, you may have Rashi's understanding of it, and you may have Rabbeinu Tam's understanding of it, not necessarily the same, correct? And you may find that Rabbeinu Hananel says something different from both of them. And you may discover that the Rif is more like Rabbeinu Hananel, or maybe he's not. And you may discover that that Rambam's Perush understanding and his Psak Halacha aligns with Rashi and not with Rabbeinu. And you may discover it's the other way around. And there are many other Chachamim we could mention, the Reed and the Rosh and the Rashba and the Ramban. Baruch Hashem, many great Chachmei Torah have existed within the Jewish people over the millennia. How can any one of those Chachamim claim, and in fact, did any one of those Chachamim ever say, you have to listen to me? You show me, please, where in any place in the entire Talmud Bavli Rashi says, this is my Perush, and you have to listen to me. You have to listen to what I just told you. Don't listen to anyone else. Not to my grandson Rabbeinu Tam when he comes along, and not to my Rav Rabbeinu Yehuda Bar Yakar, whom I'm disagreeing with. Don't listen to them. Listen only to me. You're chayav to listen only to me. Where did Rashi say that? Never. Where did the Rif say that? Never. When the Rambam, Rabbeinu Tam, the Ramban, none of the Chachamim could ever have said such a thing. How could they say such a thing? That's ridiculous. All they can say is, I'm telling you, I'm calling it as I see it. I'm telling you this is what I believe it to be saying, to the best of my ability. And I'm probably wiser than you are, so you may want to take what I'm saying into account, but that's up to you. I can't possibly tell you. I cannot force you. I cannot insist that you accept my position. How could anyone say such a thing? No one could. Now, if you read the Hakdama of the Beth Yosef to the Beth Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Kar to the Beth Yosef on the Tur, you will find exactly the same thing. He says, this is what I suggest, and those who want to rely on me can rely on me. That's what he says. He doesn't say you have to listen to him. No Chacham could ever have made such a statement. It would have been outlandish to say such a thing. That's the first thing that has to be understood.
Except for pseudo scholars today say things like that.
I wouldn't say unfortunately, I would say it's not only pseudo scholars. I would say there are many very scholarly people who have adopted that position. For instance, you may have heard certain Sfaradi Chachamim say that Kibanu Piskei Maran, we have accepted upon ourselves the Psak Halacha of the Beth Yosef, of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and we are obligated to that position. Now, if you accept it upon yourself, that's up to you, that's fine. But you cannot accept anything upon yourself for your son, or your grandson, or your neighbor. How can you do that? You can accept it upon yourself. You can say, I think that Rabbi Yosef Karo is the Chacham that we can, or I at least I feel that I can rely on, or should rely on. I see that he's a great Chacham. I see he wrote all these works. He quotes all these sources, and this is his conclusion. I accept I wish to go follow his position and his act and work with his psak halacha, with his view. That's a reasonable thing to say, because a person says, I don't know how to go through all this material and come up with the right answer every time. I think he knows much more than I do. And almost certainly most people will be right if they make that assumption. So that's a reasonable thing to say. How can you say to someone else, because I decided that he's the person to follow, that you also have to follow him? How can that be? So they will tell you all kinds of Boblemises that the 250 Rabbanim accepted the Shulchan Aruch. First of all, I don't know if that ever happened. I don't know how that could be. There were not 250 Rabbanim in Tzfat at the time of the Beit Yosef. There were only a handful of big league, major league Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael at that time to begin with, and not all of them were in Tzfat. And some were in Yerushalayim famously and didn't agree with the Beit Yosef on certain things, like like the Rabbah and what have you. And that's all stories. That's just fairy tales. There's no basis to any of that. Now, exactly the same kind of fairy tale you will hear from many Ashkenazi Rabbanim. In fact, most Ashkenazi Rabbanim, what will they tell you? They will tell you, the Ashkenazim accepted upon themselves the psak halacha of the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who lived in Poland, in Krakow, around the same time as the Beit Yosef, let's say 500 years ago, and we are required to follow his position. Why? Lama kacha. No one can explain to you why. Who decided that we have to accepted the Rama? Who made this decision? Can anyone point to some kind of a conference or a gathering of Chachamim, not to mention all the Jews in Poland or all the Jews in Germany or what have you, who got together and discussed this and said, yes, we have agreed amongst ourselves, either unanimously or by majority view, that we will accept the psak halacha of the Rama. Did such a meeting ever take place? I think you know the answer. Never took place. It couldn't possibly have happened. How could the Jews even have got together from all the various far-flung points of the compass in Europe at that time? Just as the Jews in the Sephardi world could not possibly have gathered and discussed such a thing. It's not even the case that the Rabbanim could have written to each other and by writing or something come up with some kind of consensus. There was never such a thing. All this is Boblemises. In other words, it's a fairy tale. So what actually happened? What actually happened is the following. Hundreds of years before the Beit Yosef and before the Ramah, you already had two halachic realities in place, which grew up over centuries. In other words, in Sephardi lands, that is to say, in places initially like Spain and Portugal, later in and North Africa, and Middle East, you had those Jewish communities that traditionally followed the halachic opinions of Chachamim like the Rif and the Rambam. Why? Well, first of all, you don't need any excuse to follow the Rif or the Rambam, because these are amongst the greatest Chachamim, halachic Chachamim, Chachmei halacha that ever existed. Why wouldn't you wish to follow them? But then you could ask, well, why not Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam or the Riaz Zaken or the Rosh? And the answer is because they were familiar with the Rif and the Rambam, because they lived in the same part of the world. These were their local Chachamim. The Rif lived in Spain and then in Morocco. The Rambam also originally in Spain, then later in Egypt. These Chachamim were their local Chachamim. These are the people they sent letters to and asked questions of, and they were familiar with their writings and their Piskei Halacha going back centuries. So a certain halachic, and even before the time of the Rif, based on the opinions of many of the Geonim in Bavel and other parts of the world later, like Rabbeinu Hananel in Kairouan, in Tunisia, etc. These Jewish communities for centuries had been following the Piskei Halacha, in other words, the interpretations and understandings of the Talmud of these Chachamim. That was a reality long before the Bet Yosef was born, centuries before, in fact. And exactly the same thing happened in Europe with the Ashkenazim. For centuries, they had been following the interpretations and therefore the Piskei Halacha, because every Psak Halacha, at least in theory, should be based on some interpretation of what Chazal is saying in the Mishnah, the Talmud, etc., of Rashi and the Tosafot. That is to say, Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Yitzchak Bala Tosafot, Riazaken, and the Rash Mishant, and Marami Rothenburg, and his Talmid, the Rosh, and his Talmid, the Mordechai. These Piskei Halacha were in place, and these opinions were known amongst the Jews in Ashkenaz for centuries. And they followed the views of their local Chachamim. Who else were they going to follow? When you have a medical lahavdil, but when you have a medical issue, you turn to a doctor that you have access to. Today, you may have access to a doctor in New Zealand because you can speak to him on Zoom or something. But once upon a time, you had to go to the doctor down the road, right? Or maybe the most 100 miles away, correct? So you go to to those chachamim to whom you have access, or to whose writings you have access in the first place. So in Ashkenaz, over centuries, these halachic opinions and practices were in place. So when the Bet Yosef wrote his Bet Yosef, on his Perush on the Tur, and when he wrote his Shulchan Aruch, you already had these two Jewish worlds, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi world, which had been existing contemporaneously, and in tandem, but in parallel universes for some centuries before. So if the Shulchan Aruch writes a book, which 80% of the time, shall we say, which is roughly the reality, 80% of the time conforms with the Sephardi practice that has been in place for centuries, by definition, it's not going to be an acceptable text to the Ashkenazim, who've been for centuries doing something different. So that book is just essentially going to be relevant to them. They're not going to be able to do much with it. They're not going to change everything they've been doing for centuries. Why would they? Because some Rav they've bekoshi heard of comes along after centuries. They've been following Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam and the Rosh, and who says, no, you should listen to the Rambam. That's not how Jews work. Jews follow tradition. Jews follow minhag. Jews follow what their grandfathers did, etc. What the local Rav says. That's how Jews work. So the Shulchan Aruch, had it been left in its original form without the additions of the Ramah, the Hagahot of the Ramah, would today probably be an unknown book altogether. Because the Ashkenazim would never have looked at it. Because it would have contradicted what they've been doing for centuries, maybe for a millennium, 80% of the time. In Ilchot Shabbat, in Ilchot Tefillah, in Ilchot Birkat Hamazon, in Ilchot Pesach. So the Bet Yosef says you can eat kitniot. The Ramah says you don't eat kitniot. So how are they going to follow the Bet Yosef? So had the Ramah not written Hagoth HaRamah, the Shulchan Aruch, I suspect that the Shulchan Aruch would have almost not been known today, at least not outside certain Sephardi circles. It would have been an irrelevant sefer, even if it's a wonderful sefer, but it would not have been meaningful. It would not have been a useful, practical guidebook for Ashkenazi Jews. The Ramah saved it from oblivion, basically, almost, because he wrote the Hagot HaRamah. And that turned it into a book, which means that an Ashkenazi and a Sephardi can both learn that same book and walk away happy. Because if you read the Bet Yosef in your Sephardi, it says, this is what we do, this is what you should do. They'll say, well, yeah, we know that's what we've been doing in Shul all along. That's what my grandfather did as well. Nothing new here. Because most of the time, the Shulchan Aruch is not saying anything new. This is what the Sephardim were doing for centuries before he came along. And the same is true for the Ramah. If an Ashkenazi reads what the Ramah says, this is what we do, you say, yeah, I know that. That's what my grandfather did, and that's what we've been doing in Shul, and this is what everyone says. And what I'm saying is, what the Bet Yosef and what the Ramah both did, essentially, was to take an halachic snapshot of practice in the Jewish world in their time. each in his own part of the world. And that was written down in book form, so that an Ashkenazi and a Sfaradi could both now take this book, the Shulchan Aruch, and live with it. It's a practical, well written and convenient practical guidebook for halacha on a daily basis for any Jew in any part of the world, essentially, except perhaps for Teiman, which was a tiny, almost unknown Jewish community for most Jews in the world. They'd been living in isolation for so long that most Jews didn't even know there were Jews in Teiman. So essentially what I'm telling you is it's the exact opposite of what you've been told. It's not that the Sfaradim accepted the Beth Yosef and the Ashkenazim accepted the Ramah. It's exactly the other way around. The reverse is the fact. The Beth Yosef wrote an halachic text based on what the Sfaradim had been doing for centuries and made that the standard, the gold standard. And the Ramah did exactly the same thing for this Ashkenazim. He wrote down what the Ashkenazim had been doing based on earlier Chachamim, as we mentioned before, for many centuries. And he wrote that down as this is our gold standard. So no one actually accepted anything. It's not that the Jewish world accepted the Shulchan Aruch. No one accepted anything new. No one, not a single Jew changed anything because of the appearance of the Shulchan Aruch on the scene. The Sfaradim continued to do what the Sfaradim had always done, and the Ashkenazim continued to do what the Ashkenazim had always done. Nothing changed, and therefore no one accepted anything. It's a complete fiction. What happened was that now there was a useful handbook, a brief, concise, useful handbook that both an Ashkenazi and a Sfaradi could use and refer to as, and if they wanted to argue amongst themselves, halachically, Sfaradi Rabbanim and Ashkenazi Rabbanim, they had a common text to which they could refer and argue over and discuss. But no one changed anything. No one had to accept anything because the Sephardim were not about to accept a whole new world of psak halacha based on what the Ashkenazim have been saying and doing for centuries. And exactly the same was true for the Ashkenazim. They were not about to accept a whole new world of customs and piskei halacha based on what the Sephardim have been saying and doing for centuries. It's not going to happen. That's not how Jews work. Anyone who knows Jews knows that Jews are stubborn, Jews are fixed in their ways, and they won't change very easily and quickly. And they're maybe not supposed to, usually, unless you have very, very good reason to. For example, as we discussed earlier about the sukkah, sleeping in the sukkah or not. It may be the fact that most Jews didn't sleep in the sukkah for a very, very long time, for all kinds of reasons, some of which were valid and some of which were perhaps invalid. But when that reality changes, as it should, in other words, when you come to Eretz Yisrael, you return to your ancestral homeland, you're able to sleep in the sukkah, then the true authentic Torah should now kick in and again become operative. And you should sleep in the sukkah, if at all possible, if it's not raining, if it's not too cold, or whatever the case may be. That's in those situations, Jews should change their practice. But otherwise, Jews don't change their practice, certainly not flippantly. So this idea that the Jewish world accepted, the Jewish people accepted the Shulchan Aruch is the biggest fairy tale that you've ever heard.
So, it's very new to me. So what is the alternative? The average person is not able to spend the hours daily required.
The question was asked by Meir, what is the alternative? Correct?
The average person is just not able to.
Okay, well that's a correct, a very reasonable question. The answer is, first of all, that the average person is never going to be, not even the average Rav and the average Talmid Chachamim nowadays, or even 500 years ago, is not going to be the Rosh, or Rashi, or Rabbeinu Tam, or Rav Hai Gaon. That's just not going to happen, because such Gedolim, Torah sages, such giants of Torah, are few and far between. That's how it's supposed to be. That's why we learn their writings to this day. The answer, what a Jew should do, is very simple. First of all, there is a mitzvah, there is a chovah, an obligation for every Jew to study Torah, each to his own ability, based on the time available and his background and his education, etc. And we can discuss in on another occasion, but the basic instruction and recommendation of Hazal is and of the halakha as it appears in all the books, in the Rambam and the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, etc., is that a person is to divide their study into three sections. Those three categories are defined by Chazal as Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. Those are the categories that Chazal refer to. And in order to study, and what is Mishnah? Mishnah is a brief, concise rendition of the basic halachot. That's what the Mishnah is, without any discussion. And that's basically what the Rambam is. Rambam gives you in the same language as the Mishnah, the bottom line, without going into much explanation and discussion. He does manage to introduce, because of his genius and his ability to distill things and just in few words to add very illuminating comments and remarks. But briefly, the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam is like the Mishnah. You're studying the basics of the halakha without understanding all the reasons why. Another way of approaching the study of halakha without going into all the primary sources is the Rif or the Rosh or what have you, or the Tur or the Shulchan Aruch. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages, which we can discuss on another occasion. A Jew should spend some time regularly studying one of these types of halachic texts to the best of his ability. But we also have what the Mishnah tells us in Masechet Avot on two occasions. In the first perek of Masechet Avot, Aseh lach Rav, you should have a Rav, a teacher that you turn to. Rambam explains the two separate statements. So the second one says, Aseh lach Rav v'istalek min asafek. So Rambam explains the first one refers to you should have someone from whom you study Torah. All right, today we have lots of books and we have other online ways of studying Torah. So perhaps you need less than in ancient times a physical Rav, someone that you can connect to physically, face to face, although that's always a good thing. And the other statement of the Mishnah in that perek of Masechet Avot, Aseh lach Rav v'istalech min asafek, Rambam says refers to psak halacha, someone that you can ask when you have a question. So a Jew should have a Rav that he turns to with questions when he doesn't know what the answer is. But in order that he not have to turn to this person every 2 minutes during his day, he should have some basic idea of what should be the case, what I should be doing, what I'm required to do, which he should be able to discover by studying Torah in a regular and constant manner. It doesn't have to be 10 hours a day; it can be an hour a day, if that's what the time that the person has available. Although hopefully it'll be more, but let's say. So that's the answer. No one is telling the average Jew you have to be a Rambam or a Rosh or a Rashi or a Shulchan Aruch or a Gra. No one's saying that. But you are required to run your life and set up your schedule in such a way that you can be involved in the study of Torah in a constant, regular manner. And you should have a connection with at least one chacham that you can discuss things with if you need to. That's the bottom line.
Right. Even though in the process, a person is not going to be fulfilling as much as the standard, or perhaps that standard is going to change as they get older and understand more and learn more. It's going to change and become better. But there's going to be a time where they're just not fulfilling as much as they should be, perhaps. Is that?
I'm not sure I'm following you. When you say fulfilling, you mean there will be a time. There will be a time
No, in other words,
life
a
when
person
they're not aware of all the things they should do or how they
right,
should
right.
approach
So
certain things.
right.
Well,
Mhm.
one
It's going to take time to be aware of all different mitzvahs and
well, okay. So first of all, hopefully, if a person was brought up in a community and place where he was able to imbibe, as it were, and subsume into himself the the way that Torah Jews do things and how they relate to various things. Hopefully, the examples that he's seen before his eyes are good examples and good indications of what needs to be done. Then he has some rough idea of what is to
Right.
be
But
done.
the details is what I'm talking. The details, the pratim, the
Details
details.
also, a lot,
The,
most Jews have always picked up the details also most of the time from what they saw at home, what they saw in the community, what they saw in shul. More learned people will be more aware and understand more. That's always the case. That's
and
always
that's okay. And that's okay though. That's what I'm saying. That's okay.
that's fine. That's the
That's
world. That's life. That's the reality.
mhm.
Mayor,
That's
did I catch you smile when I smiled? Tell me if my powers of telepathy are on here,
uh,
or if it's just my own experience when the Rav said you don't have to be a Rashi, you don't have to be a tremendous giant.
mhm.
Were you smiling as I was because you had heard the opposite in different yeshiva systems, and or you work with young men who are being told the
Mhm.
opposite today, that they must
Yeah.
devote themselves completely
Right.
to study and negate
Completely.
themselves, and if they don't end up being with a
Mhm.
photographic memory and a genius level of scholarship, that they're somehow less than, and that seeps into their. Is
Right.
that why you were
Absolutely.
smiling? That's why I was
It's
smiling.
even worse, Michael, because it's not spoken. It's the unspoken that's not being told, not being mentioned, but it seeps in even more, and it's even worse, obviously. Mhm.
100%.
Wow.
if it is true that this is a common phenomenon among young Jewish men, shall we say, in the yeshiva world, uh, that they are made to feel that each one of them has to become at least a Rabbi Akiva Eger, then there's something wrong with that. It's a wonderful aspiration, and
Mhm.
some very few people can aspire to such a thing. That's the reality. It's like that would be like telling students of physics that everyone can be and is likely to and should aspire to becoming an Einstein, and there's no reason for you not to be. And if you're not, then it's your problem. You're just lazy, not
Mhm.
applying
That's
yourself,
absolutely. That's
or
exactly it.
something. Well,
That's
that
right.
obviously is
Something's wrong with you. Something's wrong with you
that's
because it's
ridiculous.
obvious you could do it and you should do it.
That's
So,
ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Truly ridiculous. It's like was any Jew ever told you should be a Moshe Rabbeinu, and if you're not, then you're culpable?
mhm.
This is not reasonable, and nor is it conducive, as you're implying, the two of you now correctly, to wholesome, uh, comprehensive mental health.
And right. And this is the greatest tragedy of our Golos is we have severed the connection to the Creator Himself. Because clearly it's not Ratzon Hashem. These are people brought into the world in certain ways. And I mean, to say that, oh, they have to be like this, I mean, it's just, we have no idea. The Makar, the source of life, the Ribbon Shalom, it's ignored, it's gone. It's about the rabbis. It has become about the rabbis. I mean, there's no other way to say it.
On the
But to
one
think,
hand,
what
on the
does,
one hand, it's entirely
Mhm,
true and correct
mhm,
that a Jew feels that uh, we pray to Hashem lekayim banu hachmei Torah, that Hashem
mhm,
should maintain amongst us true hachmei Torah. And that's a very true and profound understanding of Jewish life. That's how it should be. But it's not true that all aspects of Jewish existence, as we've discussed today, Temti Mamlechet Kohanim V'Roy Kadosh, all aspects of the fulfillment and the consummation of those ideas and those aspirations and goals for the Jewish people, not all of that is something that rabbis, chachamim, can or must do. You need, for example, true uh, political leadership, which is not always the same as Torah leadership. You need military leaders. Again, different kind of person. Usually, the kind of person who is steeped in his Sforim and in his learning and in Rashi and the Beit Yosef is not the same person who is likely. Sometimes you can have rare individuals who can incorporate these different sets of talents or these capabilities, but usually it's not the same person. The person who can lead soldiers into battle is not the same person who can give the great shiur on and explain where the Ran and the Rambam disagree. Not usually the same person, but you need both. The Jewish people need both those people. And many other kinds of people. The Jewish people needs Jewish scientists and Jewish rocket scientists and people to develop weapons to destroy our enemies because our enemies need to be destroyed because they are evil. That is what we believe. We don't believe that all people are the same and all societies are equivalent and all cultures and systems are to be equally revered. No, we believe there is good and there is bad. There is right and there is wrong. That's what we believe. And that's what the Jewish people have always believed. So we need rocket scientists and we need doctors and we need financiers and we need Talmidei Chachamim. That is a healthy, normal Jewish society. And we need Jewish farmers and shepherds and plumbers and road builders. And no, we shouldn't have all such things done by foreign workers or our enemies. No, that's not how it should be. And every Jew has an important contribution to make to himself, his family, his community, and to his nation. That is the normal way of viewing the Jewish world. Now, in the Galuth, because everything else is essentially inoperative, so all that's left is the Bet Midrash. So everything becomes about the Bet Midrash. But this is exactly what it states in Masechet Berachot, in the Talmud Bavli, that Misha Nehrav Bet HaMikdash, En La Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ela Arba Amoth Shel Halacha Bilevad. That's wonderful, but what did it just say? This is the case when the Mikdash is no longer, and the Mikdash is just a word or a term or a label for the normal, healthy, complete Jewish reality. When that is no longer in place, what's left is Arba Moth Shehalacha Bilevad. But to say that the Jewish world is only Arba Moth Shehalacha Bilevad, that is an aberration. That is a distortion of what the Torah and Judaism are all about. And I'm afraid to have to agree with you, if I understood you correctly, that both of you, that many people in the Torah world are misrepresenting what the Torah is about and what the Jewish life and existence should be about. And if this is something that many young men in the yeshiva world need to hear, well, more power to you. You need to make sure that they hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rav. Thank
So
you.
we'll stop here for today.
Thank you so much.
היו ברוכים.
All the best.
שלום
Amen.
וניצחון. על
Amen.
כל אויבינו מבית ומחוץ. השם יהיה
Amen.
עמכם.
Amen.
Amen.
Shalom
Thank you,
Lamad.
Rav.
Rabbeinu.